Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor, moderated by Professor Mike Kaler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA.
Kreller has been the leader in enhanced due diligence involving FCPA compliance programs since 1988. Our boots-on-the-ground research, combined with our in-house team of licensed investigators, allows us to continually outperform even the most sophisticated database providers. For the past 30 years, Kreller has become synonymous with high-quality, decisionable reports that uncover hidden truths that our competitors routinely miss. Kreller also has a best-in-class case management system, Kreller Online, which allows for companies to develop and administer their own questionnaires, risk ranking scoring, and third-party training, while continuously monitoring the companies and shareholders through worldwide sanction lists.
Thank you for listening to the FCPA Flash podcast. This is Professor Mike Kaler, and I invite you to my next FCPA Institute in Nashville on May 3rd through the 4th. To learn more about the two-day FCPA Institute and how it has elevated the FCPA knowledge and practical skills of a diverse group of professionals, please visit fcpaprofessor.com and click on the FCPA Institute page. Welcome to FCPA Flash, sponsored by the Kreller Group. This is Professor Mike Kaler. And in today's episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Gregory Paw, a partner with Pepper Hamilton and consultant to the Free Group International Solutions. Greg has extensive experience in FCPA matters in Latin America. And I'm also pleased to be joined by Sandra Orihuela. She is the founder of a legal boutique firm in Peru specializing in corporate international matters, anti-bribery prevention and compliance, and she's a dual licensed attorney in both the United States and Peru. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
We're going to talk about developments in Latin America, and many conversations regarding this topic start with an FCPA enforcement action brought by the U.S. law enforcement authorities against Brazilian company Odebrecht in December 2016. Much of that improper conduct focused on the company's relationship with Brazilian officials, but also alleged improper conduct in many other countries in the region: Argentina, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Peru, and Venezuela. And the question is, why does this 15-month-old settlement now still have a lot of relevance in Latin America and the South America region?
Yeah, it's interesting because Odebrecht is a settlement that took place in 2016, and oftentimes for the United States, the settlement will be announced, and then everyone talks about it for a few years. It sort of passes by the wayside. In this case has really had a ramification throughout Latin America that is an amazing thing to be watching in real time. And those different impacts in different countries that you discussed that were mentioned in the settlement itself, each have brought about sort of follow-on procedures in a number of different countries, including in Peru most significantly. And Sandra and I have actually sort of seen this in a very front-row kind of way, watching the maturation of the prosecution in Peru of several different politicians and several companies that have been involved with Odebrecht and their improper conduct. Very interestingly, there currently is an impeachment proceeding that's being brought against the current sitting president in Peru that is in large part connected to the Odebrecht scandal. So watching this and watching the waves of activity that have taken place across Latin America has really been a very important part of anti-corruption work in the last year and a half.
And Sandra, tell us what you're seeing from your perspective in Peru regarding this FCPA enforcement action against Odebrecht.
Well, these are very interesting times for Peru. I mean, this is one of the largest actions or corruption-related crises that Peru has ever faced. Not that Peru or any other country in Latin America hasn't seen corruption scandals before, but this is by large the largest and the case that has had the most impact, just because of how many politicians, how many corporate entities and individuals have reached. So there are significant investigations. There's been all kinds of investigations by the prosecutor in collaboration, by the Peruvian prosecutor in collaboration with the Brazilian prosecution team. And it's a case that keeps evolving. It's been now a year and a half almost since the 2016 sanctions in the U.S. And since then, it's just has grown, to a level that I don't think anybody anticipated, and also has reached people that never before was able to reach in this type of actions. I'm talking about private citizens that were put in preventive jail for allegations of corruption. And right now, as Greg has mentioned, even the president is facing impeachment. So this involves politicians, people from private companies, and different projects. I think starting from 2004 all the way to 2015. So there are actually very few politicians and very few companies, like in the construction sector, that are not involved in this crisis.
Now, the Odebrecht action involved both a U.S. component, a Brazilian component, as well as other foreign law enforcement involved. Do you think this widespread reaction is a result of the U.S. prong of the enforcement action? Stated differently, would the reactions you're seeing on the ground there have been the same if this was only perhaps a Brazilian law enforcement action against Odebrecht?
I actually think that's one of the most interesting things about this case, Mike. The U.S. did bring the enforcement action, and from the overall settlement, the U.S. received a very small proportion, only about 10% of the settlement proceeds. The lion's share went to the Brazilian enforcement authorities, and that reflects the fact that a lot of the enforcement actions, both against Odebrecht and against Petrobras, the large state-owned oil company in Brazil, really resulted from very aggressive prosecution that's taken place, starting with the Brazilian prosecutors. And now these Brazilian prosecutors have actually formed cooperation agreements across Latin America with other countries. And they're spreading some of their techniques, and they're certainly spreading information that they're developing in the course of the Odebrecht and Petrobras investigations, so that they're sharing that information with other countries so that they can then bring enforcement actions. The prosecutors in Peru asked for permission to do interrogations of different cooperators that have been developed, including the former CEO of Odebrecht itself. And a lot of the information that's coming about is coming from this continuing information sharing. So that this infrastructure that's developing of the prosecution capacity of several of these different Latin American countries is really one of the most amazing things to watch. And we certainly expect to see much more activity, but to see companies of this nature, which were very powerful companies, some state-owned enterprises, some that were, just among the most rich and famous companies, and then some of the most rich and famous people to fall under the prosecution as well, has really been really a fascinating thing to watch as these prosecutors spread their wings.
Yes, I agree. The collaboration with the Brazilian prosecutors has really had a gigantic impact, I think, for Peru. And obviously the participation of the U.S. that, helped Brazilians move forward or perhaps find additional issues has also helped a lot. But the reliance and the collaboration among different prosecutors in different countries with the Brazilian team, really that hasn't been seen before.
Yeah, and the other thing that's happened that's really interesting is that there are a number of new laws that have come about that are helping the prosecutors in these countries. So in Brazil, it's very frequent to talk about the Clean Companies Act, which was a landmark piece of legislation that gave corporate liability for bribery offenses. But there's other laws as well, like an organized crime bill, that added new tools to the prosecutor's arsenal, like plea bargaining ability that previously had been unseen in Brazil. So that's really important. And I know, Sandra, there's new legislation in Peru that also addresses bribery.
That's right. There's been two, actually 3 by now, because there's been a number of regulations that have just started to take effect this year, as early as January 1st. So now corporate entities are going to be subject to criminal liability in Peru. That was not the case before, and there are also a number of other measures, such as an emergency decree that is in the works to basically require the companies, the Odebrecht principally, that has already admitted to wrongdoing, and the partners of Odebrecht to contribute to a special fund created by the government in anticipation. Basically, is an advance of the fine that the companies would be expected to pay later on. So they're doing this in order to advance projects and to protect some of the creditors of these groups, and to try to ensure that some of the open projects are completed.
So Odebrecht obviously was a very high-profile case involving conduct in the region. Are there new cases being investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice and SEC, or are these local cases, or are they a little bit of both, perhaps?
Well, I think that the signals that I've seen are that the U.S. prosecutors are very happy to see the Latin American countries take the lead on some of these important enforcement actions. And I think that this was really a goal of U.S. law enforcement to hope to develop this kind of capacity in Latin American and of course in other countries as well. There was just last week, there was actually a sentencing of the CEO of Petrobras in Brazil that was an entirely Brazilian proceeding based on bribes that new CEO had received from Odebrecht, $1 million in bribes. And interestingly, this CEO had been brought in by Petrobras in 2015 to try to clean up the mess that had been created by the prior regime and the corruption that had taken place at Petrobras. So seeing the will of the Brazilian and the other Latin American prosecutors to bring those kind of cases, I think is very heartening. And really, I think it's not being lost on the society and corporations that Sandra and I have dealt with. We've seen some really interesting trends in corporate compliance with some of the companies that we deal with. We've seen companies that are starting to bring together trade associations that are dedicated to transparency and anti-corruption. We've seen companies that are very interested in receiving ISO compliance certifications because they know that by getting that kind of a certification, multinational companies will be more willing to work with them to know that they have the right approach to compliance. And we've even seen in Chile, we saw a company that basically brands itself on the fact that it has compliance and transparency in its DNA. So I think all of this is the type of activity that international anti-corruption lawyers and activists have really hoped for. And while it's a long path, and certainly it's something that's going to continue over some years, it's really important. And I know, Sandra, under that new law in Peru, there's really a very high incentive for Peruvian companies to develop their own compliance programs. Isn't that right?
Yes, the new law, the one that I mentioned that started to take effect this year, basically requires all companies, regardless of size, to have a compliance program in place. And it actually it mitigates some of the penalties that the companies could have if, let's say, for those companies that are under investigation right now but that have not yet been sanctioned, if they are to have or to put in place a compliance program before the sanctioning process, that will mitigate the fine, the penalties that they could have. So, yes, I believe the compliance culture and the perception of people towards compliance has changed tremendously because of all of these cases. When I started, doing FCPA back in 2012, people didn't even know what it meant. And by now, the reaction and also the response to the new law and to the new international requirements is totally different. Companies are, in fact, looking to have the programs in place. And the regulations have helped. There are a number of other regulations for specific industries, for instance, that even tell you how you have to screen your clients, your service providers. So, the law has helped a lot. The requirements have helped a lot. And we're now just hoping that, enforcement of all of this new legislation will go hand by hand with the enactment of the regulations.
So you've both talked about trends in compliance within companies in that region over the last several years. Is the inference there that, 3-5 years ago, Peruvian companies, Brazilian companies, and other companies in that region didn't care at all about compliance, didn't have any policies and procedures in place? Have we gone from nothing to something, or was, what was the baseline 3 to 5 years ago?
Well, I think that maybe the more regulated industries, such as banking and other entities, did have some compliance program, or perhaps the groups or the companies that had dual listings were paying perhaps a bit closer attention. But yes, I would say that we have gone pretty much from zero compliance, from very basic compliance, like for instance just having something in writing, to actually trying to implement a program. That has been a gigantic change.
Greg, what's your observation on that, working with the companies you work with in the region?
Yeah, I agree with Sandra. I think that the incentives, starting with the Clean Companies Act in Brazil, but certainly with other laws, even local laws now in Brazil, that are requiring in certain states companies to have compliance programs, has really focused people, I think, very, very, very closely on this issue. And I know even from companies that I've worked with that are trying to do compliance hiring right now in the Latin American market, compliance officers are very much in demand because the attention is really focused on this issue, and they are looking for people who know how to do this and know how to implement it in a way that will be respected and will be accepted by the authorities, who are going to be looking very closely at these kind of things if a company does want to follow any of the anti-corruption laws.
There's an interesting parallel in the United States, whether we pin the precise date at 2000 or 2005 or whatnot. Over the last 15, 20 years in the United States, the compliance function has significantly improved in business organizations. But the irony with that is there's been more, not less, FCPA enforcement over that same general time period. So I'm interested in your predictions as to what will happen over the next 5-10 years because of this increase in compliance. Are we going to see less enforcement? Or perhaps like in the United States, are we going to see more enforcement? And if the latter, what does that really mean in the grand scheme of things then?
Yeah, well, that's a very fair question, and it's a question that we actually get quite a bit when we talk to companies in Latin America, because they'll say to us, you look at our country, but we look at the United States, and we see corruption issues in the United States, so what credibility does the United States have to push this as an issue? And I concede that point when people say that. I was traveling in Latin America during the recent trial of the New Jersey Senator Menendez, and I explained to the audience that we still struggle with issues of corruption in the United States, and I think the most important thing is to develop the capacity as a society to deal with these things in a transparent way, to have them brought in courts of justice where juries or judges can decide whether or not there is an issue, but for the society to understand the importance of focusing on clean government and clean business. So the attention to it may never go away as a corporate problem. There is always human nature that comes into these situations, but the focus on it and the transparency to it is really the key. And hopefully, as generations grow up with this type of enforcement of compliance and turning to business that does not rely on bribery, that will take hold over a generation that's a more reliable way to do business.
Of course, transparency and judicial scrutiny are important, but that rarely even happens in the FCPA context.
Yeah, well, I'm optimistic that it'll happen more. We certainly have incentives in the markets that we've been discussing today, and in the United States to have more disclosures, even by companies that discover this on their own. So there certainly are incentives now for companies to be considering the disclosure and for bringing that transparency that you just mentioned.
So, Sandra, what does this all mean? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was saying I agree with Greg. I agree with that the main change perhaps has to be in society, and I think that Latin America, I think every country has seen what corruption has done in their own countries, and the culture has to, in fact, change because this was just accepted. Growing up here, this wasn't anything unusual to see companies and people, and it was an everyday thing. Basically, the bribes were an everyday thing. So I don't think one gigantic crisis is going to change, but I think it has created an effect that hopefully will keep growing. And, if I can have a prediction, it could be that there will be more investigations. The prosecutors have a power, like a different strength or power that they didn't have before, and I think that this is because society is supporting that, and there will probably be more investigations and more cases, but I think that as in the U.S., the culture will have an impact. This will have an impact on the culture, and hopefully, there will be more transparency and more demand from society that these cases keep their course.
So
agreed. If you would have told Brazilians 10 years ago that Marcelo Odebrecht would spend 18 months or 2 years in prison, they never would have believed you. But now that's happened. That's right. That's your reality. So that's significant change. That's really a sign of a change that's taking place at a deep level in society.
So a multinational company that may be subject to the FCPA as well as other local laws that has best-in-class FCPA compliance policies and procedures. Is there anything different or unique that this company needs to do to stay on the right side of the law in Latin America?
Well, the thing that I point to when I follow these kind of developments is that our guidance from the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission talks about having continuous improvement in our compliance programs. And it's important for compliance officers and those involved with compliance work to make sure that they're keeping up to date with the changes in their environment and relevant development that happen in their marketplaces. So, a company that's doing business in the Peruvian market or in Colombia or really anywhere in Latin America needs to be aware of what's taking place in these local markets and needs to be aware of, for example, companies that have done business with Odebrecht so that they can at least have a dialogue with them about what they're doing to try to make sure that whatever took place in the past is not going to take place in the future. There's, as Sandra said earlier in the podcast, there's scores of companies that have dealt with Odebrecht in Peru, because there's all sorts of supply chain that takes place when you're dealing with these kind of large construction projects. So if you're dealing with one of those companies, if that happens to be a vendor for a multinational in some way, there has to be a dialogue that takes place to understand what that company is doing to make sure that there's not going to be a repeat of the past.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's it. It's all very important, and I mean, it doesn't. For some companies now, they're understanding that there is a connection, even though they may not be listed in the U.S. or in Canada or in other places, or they don't have a presence there. Now, the international connection is much stronger, and it's not only for the Peruvians or the Peruvian companies doing business with international groups, but it's also for those multinationals that have branches here to realize that perhaps if they are in an industry that is subject to higher scrutiny, for example, mining, they have to comply with additional, like their compliance program has to take into account the local components of the law. So if there's a company that is listed in the DSX and is listed in the New York Stock Exchange, they may have a compliance program that is aligned with the FCPA or with the CFPOA, but they also need to take into account the local requirements that are more related to AML and to having a registry in place, to having a ton of things. A compliance officer under Peruvian legislation has a different function than the compliance officer under the U.S. or Canadian law. So it's more now. It's an integral program that has to be in place for those multinationals that have a presence in Latin America, especially when the industry that they represent is subject to additional requirements.
Bribery and corruption is obviously a much broader topic than just the FCPA, and thank you to our guests today for sharing their experience and observations concerning this topic as it relates to Latin America. Again, our guests have been Sandra Orihuela. She's the founder of a legal boutique in Peru, specializing in anti-bribery prevention and compliance, and Gregory Paw, a partner with Pepper Hamilton and consultant to the Free Group International Solutions. Thank you both for being guests on the FCPA Flash podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Mike.